Why avoidants miss the anxious ex they once rejected. Relationships are complicated, messy even, especially when it comes to avoidance and anxious types. It's almost like a dance where both are stepping on each other's toes. But here's the twisting: avoidants often miss their anxious exes, even though they pushed them away. Why does that happen? First, avoidants crave connection but fear at the same time. They want closeness, but when it gets too intense, they pull back. That anxious ex, with their deep need for reassurance, showed a kind of emotional intensity that avoidants secretly crave but don't know how to handle. Second, avoidants miss the familiarity of emotional chaos. It sounds strange, but humans are wired to cling to what's known, even if it's painful. The anxious ex brought a certain emotional rhythm that avoidants got used to. Without that, there's a strange emptiness. Third, avoidants struggle with vulnerability. The anxious partner's open expression of filling times forced avoidants to confront parts of themselves they didn't want to see. But deep down, that raw honesty was magnetic. When the anxious ex leaves, avoidants feel the absence of that emotional mirror. Fourth, avoidants miss the sense of importance and attention that anxious partners give them. Anxious people tend to put their ex at the center of their world, even if it's overwhelming. That feeling of being deeply needed, even if uncomfortable, can be addicting. And finally, avoidants miss what could have been. When the dust settles, they imagine a different story, one where they could have learned to hold space for both their own fears and their ex's needs. That hope lingers, making them look back and miss what once rejected. So, yeah, it's a complicated emotional mess, but it makes sense. Avoidants miss their anxious exes because underneath it all, they wanted connection, vulnerability, and to be truly seen, even if they didn't know how to stay. Avoidant individuals often have a complex relationship with connection. On the surface, it may seem like they want to keep people at arm's length, but deep down, they crave intimacy and closeness just as much as anyone else. The problem is not they don't want connection, it's that they are scared of what comes with it. Emotional intensity. When relationships move past casual interaction and into deeper emotional territory, avoidants experience a kind of internal alarm. This alarm triggers their instinct to pull away, to create space, and to protect themselves from feeling overwhelmed. This fear isn't simply about being alone or independent. It's rooted in a vulnerability they have difficulty managing. When an anxious partner expresses strong emotions, desires reassurance, or needs frequent closeness, avoidants can feel trapped or suffocated. That emotional intensity is like a pressure cooker. Even though avoidants long for genuine connection and be understood, the very behaviors that demonstrate care, like frequent communication, emotional check-ins, or displays of need, can make them retreat. The paradox is that the more the anxious partner reaches out, the more the avoidant pulls back, not because they don't care, but because they're coping mechanisms to guard themselves. Avoidants often learned early in life to suppress or hide their emotions as a way to stay safe. So, when someone pushes for emotional closeness, it triggers old fears and discomforts. It's not that they don't feel deeply. Many avoidants experience strong emotions, but they're skilled at bottling them up or distancing themselves so they don't have to confront those feelings directly. This emotional distance feels safer, even though it often leads to loneliness or missed opportunities for real intimacy. In relationships, this dynamic creates a push-pull pattern. Avoidants want the closeness that anxious partners demand, but they simultaneously fear losing their autonomy or being overwhelmed by the emotional demands. They want the reassurance that the anxious partner seeks, but giving that reassurance requires emotional vulnerability, something avoidants tend to avoid. The tension between wanting connection and fearing it creates internal conflict. Avoidants may find themselves longing for the very thing they run from, which can be confusing and frustrating. This fear of emotional intensity also affects how avoidants interpret their anxious partner's needs. Instead of seeing the desire for closeness as a form of love or care, avoidants may perceive it as pressure or control. The anxious partner's neediness can feel like an invasion of personal space. This misinterpretation deepens the avoidant's instinct to withdraw. The more avoidants pull away, the more anxious their partner becomes, creating a cycle that feeds into both their fears and behaviors. Yet, beneath this complicated dance lies a deep yearning for genuine intimacy. Avoidants don't want to be completely isolated, they want to be seen and accepted for who they are. But to get there, they must navigate their fears of emotional intensity and vulnerability. When they miss their anxious ex, it's often because that person represented a chance, however painful, to experience connection on a real, raw level. Despite the struggle, the avoidant about part of them recognizes that emotional closeness is what they truly need, even if it scares them. There's something deeply human about clinging to familiar, even when it's uncomfortable or painful. For avoidants, the emotional chaos that often comes with anxious partners creates a rhythm, a pattern that becomes strangely comforting over time. This familiarity, as messy as it is, forms a kind of emotional landscape that avoidants get used to, even if it's not what they consciously want. When that anxious ex is gone, the sudden quiet can feel unsettling, like a void where something essential used to be. Avoidants often experience relationships in terms of control and boundaries. Emotional chaos, with its unpredictability and intensity, is usually something they instinctively try to avoid because it challenges those boundaries. But paradoxically, when they're in a relationship with an anxious partner, that the very chaos becomes the backdrop of their emotional world. It's a familiar soundtrack they have learned to navigate. Over time, the highs and lows, the arguments, the moments of neediness, the efforts to reassure, become an expected pattern. Even if it's draining, it's known. When the relationship ends, that pattern disappears. Suddenly, there's no more chasing, no more emotional storms to weather, and no more of that dynamic push-pull energy. While this might sound like a relief for avoidance, it can actually feel like loss. It's not just the loss of the person, but the loss of the emotional environment they had adapted to. The absence of chaos means the absence of that familiar emotional rhythm. This can create a strange emptiness because while the chaos was exhausting, it was also a sign that the relationship was real and alive. Humans are wired to resist change and uncertainty. Even negative patterns become comforting simply because they're predictable. For avoidance, the emotional turmoil brought on by anxious partners may have been a way to feel connected, however indirectly. The chaos demanded engagement, interaction, and attention. Things that avoidants often struggle to ask for or maintain on their own. It was a way of feeling alive emotionally, even if it was overwhelming. Without that emotional chaos, avoidants can feel adrift. They miss the familiar feelings of tension and release, conflict and reconciliation. The absence of this dynamic can lead to boredom or a sense of numbness, which can be frightening in its own way. Avoidants may find themselves looking back and longing for the intensity they once rejected because it was at least something that stirred emotions and made them feel connected in some imperfect way. This dynamic also speaks to the human tendency to romanticize the past. When avoidants think about their anxious ex, they may overlook the difficulties and focus on the intensity, the passion, and the emotional engagement. The chaos feels like a symbol of something meaningful, rather than just a source of stress. In this way, missing the anxious ex is less about missing the person themselves and more about missing the emotional experience they brought. In truth, the emotional chaos represented a form of connection, even if it was imperfect. It was a way for avoidants to engage with emotions they usually shy away from and to experience relationships in a way that challenged their usual detachment. Losing that means losing not just a person but a part of their emotional landscape that they had grown used to, making it harder to move on. Avoidants have a complicated relationship with vulnerability. It's not that they don't feel emotions or care about others. In fact, many avoidants experience feelings very deeply. The challenge is that they often find it incredibly difficult to express those feelings openly. Vulnerability means exposing parts of themselves that they fear may be rejected, misunderstood, or judged. For avoidance, vulnerability feels like stepping into a space where they have little control. And control is something they highly value because it keeps their emotional world manageable and safe. When an anxious partner expresses their feelings openly and consistently, it can create a powerful tension for the avoidant. On one hand, that honesty is magnetic. It's refreshing to see someone willing to show raw, unfiltered emotions. On the other hand, this isn't about you not. It can feel like a threat. The avoidant fears that if they open up in the same way, they will become overwhelmed or lose their sense of independence. They may worry that sharing their inner world will make them vulnerable to pain or disappointment. The anxious partner's willingness to be emotionally honest forces the avoidant to confront a part of themselves they usually keep hidden. This can be uncomfortable, even painful. Avoidants often use emotional distance as a way to protect themselves from this kind of exposure. Yet, when they look back at their anxious ex, they sometimes realize that part of what they miss is that honest emotional mirror. The anxious partner's openness allowed the avoidant to see their own feelings reflected back at them, even if it was in an intense or challenging way. This honest emotional exchange, although difficult, offers avoidants a chance for growth. It creates a space where they might learn to accept vulnerability without feeling like they are losing themselves. However, this is a slow and often painful process. Many avoidants struggle to stay in that vulnerable space for long, retreating when emotions get too intense. That push and pull between wanting to be open and needing to protect themselves can leave avoidants feeling confused and conflicted. When avoidants miss their anxious ex, part of that longing is for this rare kind of emotional honesty. Someone who dared to be vulnerable with them. The anxious partner's emotional transparency can feel like a kind of safety net, a sign that the relationship was real and meaningful. It's a reminder that connection isn't just about physical proximity or casual interaction, but about emotional truth and willingness to share even the hard stuff. At the same time, the avoidant struggle with vulnerability means they often have a hard time expressing their own needs and fears. They might not be able to explain why they pulled away or why they missed their anxious ex in the first place. This can leave both partners feeling stuck, with the avoidant longing for connection but unable to fully reach for it. Ultimately, the tension around vulnerability is at the heart of why avoidants miss the anxious exes they once rejected. Those relationships forced them to confront fears, to engage with emotions they usually hide from, and to experience a level of honesty that is both frightening and deeply desired. It's a complicated dance, but one that shows how much avoidants, underneath it all, want to be truly known and understood, even if they struggle to admit it. Avoidants often crave attention and a sense of importance, even if they don't openly admit it. The anxious partner's intense focus on the avoidant can make them feel like the center of someone's world in a way they're not used to experiencing. This attention is deeply validating, even if it also feels overwhelming or suffocating at times. It's a paradox that avoidants fear and desire being needed so intensely. Anxious partners tend to invest a lot of emotional energy into their relationships. They seek reassurance and express their needs frequently, which can create a constant flow of communication and interaction. For avoidants, this level of attention can be a double-edged sword. On one hand, it affirms their value. It shows they matter to someone deeply. On the other hand, it can feel like too much pressure, leading them to pull away to protect their independence. When avoidants reflect on their anxious ex, they often remember this intense attention. They remember the calls, the messages, the efforts to connect, and the emotional vulnerability that came with it. Even if they found it draining at the time, there's a part of them that misses being the focus of such devotion. That feeling of being wanted, this isn't about you needed, and pursued can be intoxicating because it affirms their significance in someone else's life. This sense of importance is something avoidants might struggle to find in more balanced or casual relationships. When things are easygoing, avoidants might feel invisible or insignificant. The anxious partner's relentless neediness, while challenging, guarantees that the avoidant is never overlooked. They are constantly reminded that they matter, that their actions affect someone else deeply, and that their presence has an impact. Moreover, the anxious partner's attention often comes with emotional intensity that avoidants rarely experience otherwise. It's a kind of emotional magnetism that pulls avoidants back in, even after they've tried to create distance. The avoidant may have rejected the anxious partner because of the overwhelming emotions, but that same intensity can create a lasting impression, making it hard to fully let go. This dynamic also feeds into the avoidant's sense of self-worth. Because avoidants often hide their vulnerabilities and keep others at a distance, they might question whether they deserve love or attention. The anxious partner's unwavering focus can serve as a form of validation that counters those doubts. When that person is no longer around, avoidants may find themselves missing the feeling of being truly seen and valued. At the same time, avoidants may not always be aware of how much they miss this sense of importance. Their instinct to protect themselves by withdrawing can mask deeper feelings of longing. It's not just about missing the person, but missing the emotional experience of being needed so intensely. This creates a complicated emotional landscape where avoidants are caught between the desire for attention and the fear of losing control. In the end, avoidants miss the anxious XX not just because of the purse of what that person made them feel, seen important and deeply wanted. Even if that attention was overwhelming, it was also a form of connection that avoidants secretly crave, making it hard to move on completely. Avoidants often hold on to the idea of what a relationship could have been even after it ends. This sense of missed potential is powerful because it's tied to hope, a hope that things might have unfolded differently if only circumstances, timing, or personal readiness had been better. When avoidants look back on their anxious ex, they don't just see the conflicts or the reasons for rejection, they also imagine a different story, one where they could have stayed present, worked through their fears, and built a healthier connection. This longing for what could have been reflects a deeper desire for growth and emotional healing. Avoidants may recognize that the relationship challenged them in ways they needed but weren't ready to face at the time. The anxious ex represented not just a partner but a mirror, reflecting back their own emotional struggles and inviting them to confront vulnerability, intimacy, and attachment in a raw and honest way. Missing the anxious ex often means missing that opportunity for transformation, the chance to break old patterns and learn new ways of relating. Part of this sense of loss comes from the recognition that avoidants don't often get a second chance to engage with these intense emotional experiences. The push and pull of an avoidant-anxious dynamic is unique and complicated. Avoidants might find themselves wishing for a chance to be more open, more present, or more willing to lean into discomfort. This imagined future can feel like a balm for the pain of separation, but holds the promise of healing and connection that they felt was out of reach. The idea of what could have been also ties in avoidance struggles with commitment and fear of vulnerability. They might have pushed their anxious ex away because the relationship became too intense or threatening to their sense of independence. But after the breakup, avoidants can see the gaps they left open, the moments they withdrew, the conversations they avoided, and the emotions they suppressed. This hindsight creates a bittersweet feeling, where regret mixes with hope. In some ways, missing what could have been is a way for avoidants to stay connected to their own emotional growth journey. The anxious ex symbolizes a challenge they need to overcome, a step toward becoming someone who can handle intimacy without fear. It's a recognition that the relationship doesn't just a other person, but about learning to be whole themselves. This longing for potential also underscores the complexity of avoidant attachment. Avoidants don't want to be trapped in unhealthy patterns, yet they find themselves drawn back to familiar emotional landscapes. Missing what could have been reflects the tension between wanting something different and fearing the vulnerability required to get there. Ultimately, avoidants miss the anxious ex because that person embodied a doorway to emotional depth they weren't fully ready to walk through but now wish they had. The imagined future where they could have stayed, learned, and loved more freely lingers as a powerful reminder of both their fears and their hopes. It's a complicated blend of regret, desire, and the wish for personal growth that keeps avoidants looking back even as they try to move forward. Thank you all for listening and taking the time to explore this emotional dance with me. I hope this helped shed some light on the complexities of attachment and relationships, and maybe even offered a bit of insight for anyone navigating these feelings themselves. Take care of yourselves and each other, and remember that growth often comes from the places we least expect. Thank you once again, and goodbye.